Can you hear me?
Yes, all good. Continue, please.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Single, and today I will be showcasing the topic patterns in Python. So, what are loops? In computer science, a loop is a programming structure that repeats a sequence of instructions until a specific condition is met. Programmers use loops to cycle through values, add sums of numbers, repeat functions, and many other things. Two of the most common types of loops are the while loop and the for loop. Now let's talk about patterns. Patterns can be printed in Python using simple for loops. The first outer loop is used to handle the number of rows, and the second inner loop is used to handle the number of columns. The different types of patterns are number, character, simple pyramid, inverted, diamond, and star patterns. Now, how do we print a pattern? The first step is to input the number of rows and number of columns using the input function to determine the size of the pattern. As we already discussed before, the outer loop handles the number of rows and the inner loop handles the number of columns. The second step is to iterate rows and columns using the range function. The third step is to print the required pattern, such as star, number, character, using the print function. And the last step is to add a new line after every outer loop iteration so the pattern is displayed properly. So here are a few random patterns. There are number patterns, character patterns, pyramid patterns, star patterns, etc. Now I will show you how to execute a few patterns in Python using Jupyter Notebook. So say you would want to print this first number pattern. What we're going to do is we're going to input the number of rows to be printed in X. Then as mentioned before, we would have an outer loop that handles number of rows and an inner loop that handles number of columns. Here, the outer loop control variable is I and the inner loop control variable is J. The outer loop loops from 1 to X plus 1 and the inner loop loops from 1 to I plus 1. Now we're going to print the value in J and leave a space after it in order to get gaps in between the printed numbers.
I think there is a question here. Anika Bharti, you have a question?
No, not now.
Okay, fine. Megan, continue, please.
Okay. Then after printing the value of J, we would add a space after it. And then after that, this print statement is for this print statement goes to the next line after each inner loop, outer loop iteration in order to get the desired pattern. So let's see how this program runs. Say I input 6. This is what we're going to get as the output. Now, if we want to change the pattern to look something like this, you can see the difference in the first pattern and the second pattern, right? So all we'll have to do here is change this J to I. And instead, you would get the pattern looking like this. Now let's move on to the second program where we print a pattern with alphabets. Again, the first step would be to input the number of rows. Now, as we know, ASCII values are the numbers corresponding to the respective characters. So ASCII values of capital A to capital Z is 65 to 90. Thus, we would assign num to the ASCII value of A, which is 65. Now again, we would have a nested loop as in the previous program. An outer loop looping from 1 to n plus 1, and an inner loop looping from 1 to I plus 1. Now, as we need to print the letter and not its ASCII value, we will explicitly convert the ASCII value to character inside the loop. Then we print the character to be printed and leave gaps between the printed characters. Next, we increment num by 1 so that it goes to the next letter and then the loop goes on. So let's just run this. As we can see, it's printing the alphabets. Now, as I mentioned before, ASCII values of capital A to capital Z is 65 to 90. So in the loop, we saw that num keeps getting incremented by 1. But what happens if num crosses 90? It would start printing other characters which are not letters, and we don't want that. So here, what I have done is, if num crosses 90, we will reset it back to 65 so that it starts all over back from A. Let's try that again. Now, as we can see here, after Z, it starts from A, and that's what happens. Now, let's move on to the next program. Say we would want to print this pattern of numbers where it goes 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, and so on. So again, we're going to input the number of rows. Now again, instead of inputting, we can assign, but I have inputted. So we input the number of rows into A, and then the outer loop goes from 1 to A plus 2. Now you might wonder why A plus 2 and why not A plus 1. So let's try with A plus 1 and see what happens. I've entered 4, but I've only got till 3. That's why we need to put this as A plus 2. Here, there's 4. Okay, so after the outer loop goes from 1 to A plus 2, there's 2 inner loops. One is J and one is K. So the first inner loop will go from 1 to I minus 1, and then it will print J and leave a space after. Now we need 2 inner loops because, as we can see in the pattern, it's 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. But then after that, there's another number over here. That's why we need a second inner loop. So the second inner loop is going to go from I minus 1 to 0. And this third factor is to tell us that it's being decremented. After that, we print K and leave a space. And again, there's one more print function over here so that it goes to the next line. So let's just run that again. And here, this is how it looks. Now let's move on to patterns of equilateral triangle using asterisk symbol. So this is a simple equilateral triangle. All we have to do is, again, we input the number of rows. And here we need number of spaces also. So we've assigned K is equal to n minus 1. Number of spaces because before this is printed, there's spaces over here. N minus 1 because if this, for example, if n is 5, then it will be printed over here. But then before that, we still need 4 spaces in front of it. So we'll have an outer loop that goes from 0 to n and an inner loop that handles number of spaces that goes from 0 to k, and it prints the number of spaces. Now we're going to decrement k after each loop. So if it's 4 on the first line, it'll only print 3 on the next line, and then 2, and then 1, and so on. Now we need a second inner loop to handle the number of columns in which the values change according to the outer loop. This is the loop that prints the pattern to be printed. So it loops from 1 to I plus 1, and it prints the asterisk plus a space. Now again, we would have to have this print function, so it goes to the next line. So let's just run this. And this is what we get. Now, if we want to print the opposite of that, if we want to print an inverted equilateral triangle, we'll again input number of rows and we'll assign k is equal to 2 into m minus 2. So we'll have an outer loop that goes from m to minus 1, and this minus 1 is so that it decrements, and then another inner loop that goes from k to 0, and this again minus 1, so it decrements, and then it prints spaces. Now, in the last program, we had decremented k, but we don't want to do that here. Instead, we increment k. Now, we have another inner loop that goes from 1 to I plus 1, and we print asterisk and a space, and again, this print function is to go to the next line after each outer loop iteration. So let's run that. And this is how it looks. Now, the last program is to print a sideways equilateral triangle using the asterisk symbol. So we will input the value of k, which is the number of rows, and then we'll have an outer loop looping from 1 to k plus 1, and an inner loop looping from 1 to I plus 1. This prints the asterisk plus a space. Now, this first loop, this whole first loop only prints this much of the program. Now, we still need the rest. So we're going to have another nested loop. The next nested loop goes from k plus 1 to 0, and this minus 1 is so we know that it decrements. And the inner loop goes from 1 to I plus 1, and it prints the asterisk plus a space. And then again, we know that this goes to the next line. So if we add this first nested loop together with the second nested loop, we'll get this output. So let's run this. And this is how it looks. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope you all liked it. And if you have any doubts, then please let me know.